Think you understand how royal marriages worked? Think it was all about love, romance, and fairy tale endings? Let me tell you about a system so calculated, so ruthlessly efficient at concentrating power, that it accidentally created one of history's most horrifying biological experiments. And the subjects of this experiment? The most powerful families in Europe. Welcome to the world of dynastic marriage, where children were chess pieces, kingdoms were prizes, and genetic health was sacrificed on the altar of political power. This isn't some conspiracy theory or exaggerated tale. This is documented history, backed by genealogical records, contemporary accounts, and modern genetic analysis that proves just how catastrophically wrong this system went. Let's start with the basics. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, European royalty operated under a simple principle: marry family, keep power concentrated. But we're not talking about distant relatives here. We're talking about uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying first cousins, and in some extreme cases, patterns so tangled that a single person could be their own cousin multiple times over through different family lines. The logic seemed sound at the time. Every royal marriage was essentially a business merger. When kingdoms married their children to each other, they were forming political alliances, combining territories, and ensuring that wealth and power stayed within a controlled group of families. Marrying outside this exclusive club meant diluting influence, potentially losing territories to rival dynasties, and worst of all, from their perspective, sharing power with outsiders. The Habsburg dynasty of Austria perfected this system into an art form. They had a motto that summed up their entire strategy: Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. While other kingdoms were bleeding themselves dry in military conflicts, the Habsburgs were conquering Europe one wedding at a time. Enter Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor, who ruled from 1493 to 1519. This guy wasn't just a king. He was a strategic genius who understood that a well-placed marriage could accomplish what 10 armies could not. In 1477, he married Mary of Burgundy, instantly acquiring the wealthy Burgundian territories. But Maximilian didn't stop there. He arranged marriages for his children and grandchildren with a precision that would make modern corporate merger specialists jealous. His strategy was brilliantly simple: marry into the Spanish kingdoms, the wealthy Italian states, and other powerful European families. But here's where it gets complicated. To keep all this newly acquired power concentrated, the Habsburgs started marrying each other. And not just marrying within the extended family. We're talking about close relatives, very close relatives. The practice was considered not just acceptable but desirable among European aristocracy. In an era before modern genetics, before anyone understood DNA or heredity in scientific terms, people noticed that characteristics ran in families, but they thought this was a good thing. If your family was noble, powerful, and wealthy, then obviously you'd want to preserve those qualities by keeping marriages within the family, right? Medieval and early modern medicine had no concept of genetic load, recessive genes, or the dangers of reducing genetic diversity. They understood that sometimes close family marriages produced children with problems, but they attributed this to bad luck, divine punishment for unrelated sins, or astrological misalignment, never to the marriages themselves. The Catholic Church technically had rules against marriages that were too closely related, but these rules were flexible when political power was involved. You could get a dispensation, essentially a religious permission slip, to marry your first cousin or even your niece if you were important enough and paid the right fees. The Church collected substantial income from these dispensations, creating a perverse financial incentive to permit marriages that would later prove disastrous. Different kingdoms had different approaches to this system. The French royal family also married relatives, but tended to be slightly less extreme than the Habsburgs. The English royal family participated in the European marriage network, but being an island nation had slightly more genetic diversity simply because they occasionally married English nobility who weren't as closely related to other European royals. But the Habsburgs? They took endogamy, that's the technical term for marrying within your group, to levels that would eventually prove catastrophic. Generation after generation, they married cousins, nieces, and close relatives. Each marriage concentrated the bloodline more. Each generation reduced genetic diversity further. Here's what makes this particularly disturbing. The Habsburg family controlled territories spanning from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to parts of Italy. They were the most powerful dynasty in Europe for over 2 centuries. They had access to the best medical knowledge of their era, the finest physicians and unlimited resources. Yet they were unknowingly conducting a genetic experiment that would slowly destroy them from within. The truly horrifying part? This wasn't a secret conspiracy. This was standard operating procedure for European royalty. Marriage alliances were negotiated like corporate contracts, with lawyers, diplomats, and papal representatives hammering out details that included not just dowries and territorial agreements, but also carefully calculated family connections designed to maximize political advantage. Young princesses would be betrothed as children, sometimes as infants, to secure alliances decades in advance. These weren't love matches. These were dynastic survival strategies. And every one of these strategic marriages was adding another layer of genetic risk that nobody understood was accumulating. But there was a price being paid, a biological price that compounded with every generation, every carefully arranged marriage, every strategic alliance that prioritized power over genetic health. The Habsburgs were building an empire, sure, but they were also building a genetic time bomb that would eventually explode in the most grotesque and tragic way imaginable, and the fuse was already burning. The genetic time bomb didn't explode all at once. It started with subtle signs, small abnormalities that could be explained away, minor deformities that seemed like individual bad luck rather than a systematic pattern. But looking back with modern knowledge, we can see exactly when and how the Habsburg bloodline started its descent into biological catastrophe. Maximilian I's strategy seemed to work perfectly at first. His son Philip the Handsome, born in 1478, was by all accounts actually handsome. The nickname wasn't ironic. Philip inherited good looks from both sides of his family and didn't show obvious signs of the problems that would plague later generations. In 1496, Maximilian arranged for Philip to marry Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This was the marriage that would eventually unite the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg lines into one super dynasty. But here's where things start getting complicated. Joanna and Philip's son, born in 1500, would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Charles controlled more European territory than anyone since Charlemagne. He ruled an empire where, quite literally, the sun never set. And Charles also started showing the first clear signs of the Habsburg jaw. The Habsburg jaw, known medically as mandibular prognathism, is a condition where the lower jaw protrudes forward beyond the upper jaw. In mild cases, it's barely noticeable. In severe cases, it makes eating difficult, causes speech problems, and creates a distinctly unusual appearance that shows up clearly even in portraits painted by artists who were trying to flatter their royal subjects. Charles V had a mild version. His lower jaw stuck out slightly, his teeth didn't align properly, and he had some difficulty chewing. But it wasn't severe enough to cause major problems or prevent him from ruling effectively for decades. Contemporary accounts mention that he often ate with his mouth open because of his bite problems, but this was attributed to poor manners rather than physical inability to close his mouth properly. Here's where Charles V made the critical mistake that would doom future generations. In 1526, he married Isabella of Portugal. Sounds innocent enough, right? Just a standard royal marriage between Spain and Portugal, 2 neighboring kingdoms. Except Isabella wasn't just a Portuguese princess. She was Charles's first cousin. Her mother was Charles's aunt. They shared a significant portion of their genetic material. This marriage between first cousins should have been a warning sign. But remember, this was considered completely normal, even desirable. It kept the immense Habsburg holdings concentrated. It prevented territorial fragmentation. It was, from a political and economic standpoint, a brilliant move. From a genetic standpoint, it was adding more layers to a ticking time bomb. Charles V and Isabella had several children who survived to adulthood. Their son Philip, born in 1527, would become Philip II of Spain, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. Philip II ruled during Spain's Golden Age, commanded the largest empire the world had ever seen, and controlled wealth that made him richer than entire nations. Philip II also had a more pronounced Habsburg jaw than his father. His portraits show a clearly protruding lower jaw, and historical accounts mention that he had difficulty eating properly throughout his life. But Philip was healthy enough, intelligent enough, and politically capable enough to rule effectively for decades. The jaw was unusual, sure, but it wasn't debilitating. The real problem was what Philip II did next. He married 4 times, and 3 of those 4 marriages were to close relatives. His first wife in 1543 was Maria Manuela of Portugal. Who was Maria Manuela? His first cousin. Just like his parents had been first cousins, the genetic concentration was intensifying. This marriage between Philip and Maria Manuela produced a son in 1545. His name was Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish throne. And Don Carlos would be the first Habsburg to show that something was going seriously, catastrophically wrong with the family's genetics. Don Carlos wasn't just born with the Habsburg jaw, though he had that too. He was born with multiple deformities that were impossible to hide or explain away as minor issues. One of his legs was significantly shorter than the other, causing him to limp severely. His left shoulder was noticeably higher than his right, giving him a hunched appearance. His head was disproportionately large for his body, and his spine was curved. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. Don Carlos showed signs of serious mental instability from an early age. Historical records describe a child and young man who was prone to violent rages, who tortured animals for entertainment, who once tried to throw a servant out of a window for a minor offense, and who allegedly attempted to attack his own father with a dagger. Contemporary accounts, written by members of the Spanish court and foreign ambassadors, describe Don Carlos as frighteningly unpredictable. One moment he'd be calm, the next he'd be screaming and throwing things. He was obsessed with perceived insults and would fixate on revenge against anyone he thought had wronged him, including people who had done nothing more than look at him the wrong way. The Spanish court tried to hide the extent of Don Carlos's problems, but it was impossible. Foreign diplomats sent back reports describing the prince's bizarre behavior. There are documented accounts of him ordering boots to be cooked and served to him, then forcing servants to eat them. Of him spending hours staring at himself in mirrors, apparently fascinated by his own deformed appearance. Of violent mood swings that terrorized everyone around him. In 1562, Don Carlos had an accident that made everything worse. He fell down a staircase while chasing after a servant girl, struck his head, and was unconscious for days. When he woke up, his already unstable behavior became even more erratic. Modern medical experts who have studied the historical accounts believe he likely suffered a severe traumatic brain injury that exacerbated his existing psychological problems. Philip II faced an impossible situation. Don Carlos was his legal heir, the crown prince of Spain, but he was clearly unfit to rule. After years of trying to manage his son's behavior, Philip finally had Don Carlos arrested and confined in 1568. 6 months later, Don Carlos died in custody at age 23. The official cause was listed as illness, but historians have speculated for centuries about whether Philip ordered his own son's death to prevent him from inheriting the throne. Here's what nobody understood at the time. Don Carlos wasn't just unlucky. He wasn't cursed or possessed or suffering from some random medical condition. He was the genetic consequence of his parents both being first cousins, who were themselves children of first cousins. He inherited damaging recessive genes from both sides of his family, genes that expressed themselves in physical deformities and likely contributed to his psychological instability. But the Habsburg family didn't make the connection. They couldn't. The science didn't exist yet. They saw Don Carlos as an individual tragedy, not a warning sign of what was happening to their entire bloodline. So they kept right on doing what they'd always done, marrying within the family to concentrate power and wealth. Philip II married again after Maria Manuela's death. His fourth wife, married in 1570, was Anna of Austria. Who was Anna? His niece, his own brother's daughter, not a distant relative, not a third or fourth cousin, his niece. The Habsburg family was doubling down on the exact strategy that had produced Don Carlos. They were intensifying the genetic concentration even further. Every generation, the gene pool got smaller. Every generation, the risk of genetic disaster increased. Every generation, they were getting closer to producing something even worse than Don Carlos, and they had no idea what was. Philip II of Spain ruled for 42 years, from 1556 to 1598, over an empire so vast that it literally spanned the globe. Spanish territories stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, from the Netherlands to parts of Italy. The wealth flowing into Spain from New World silver mines made Philip the richest monarch in Europe. He commanded armies, directed global trade, and shaped European politics for half a century. But Philip II's most lasting legacy wasn't his military victories or his territorial acquisitions. It was the genetic catastrophe he set in motion through his marriages. Remember, Philip had 4 wives. His first, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin. That marriage produced Don Carlos, whose severe deformities and mental instability we've already discussed. Maria Manuela died in 1545, just days after giving birth to Don Carlos, possibly from complications related to the fact that she was delivering a severely deformed child at age 18. Philip's second marriage was to Mary the Fine of England in 1554. This was a political match designed to bring England into the Habsburg sphere of influence. Mary was 11 years older than Philip, and desperately wanted an heir to secure Catholic succession in England. But after 2 phantom pregnancies that turned out to be tumors or hormonal problems, it became clear this marriage would produce no children. Mary died in 1558, and Philip was free to marry again. His third wife was Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of the French king. She was 14 years old when they married in 1559. Philip was 32. This marriage wasn't between close relatives, and it produced 2 daughters who survived to adulthood. But Elizabeth died in 1568, possibly from complications related to miscarriage. She was just 23 years old. Then came the marriage that would prove most catastrophic for the Habsburg bloodline. In 1570, Philip II married Anna of Austria. Let's be absolutely clear about who Anna was. She was the daughter of Philip's younger brother, Maximilian II, which made her Philip's niece, his own brother's daughter. This wasn't a distant family connection. This was an uncle marrying his niece. The marriage between Philip and Anna required a special papal dispensation, because even by the loose standards of royal endogamy, an uncle-niece marriage was pushing boundaries. But the Habsburg family wanted to keep the Austrian and Spanish branches of their dynasty closely united, and marriage was how they did that. Pope Pius V granted the dispensation, and the wedding went forward. Anna was 26 when she married her 43-year-old uncle. She would spend the next 10 years in a cycle of constant pregnancy that would eventually kill her. Between 1571 and 1580, Anna gave birth to 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. And here's where the genetic consequences of Habsburg intermarrying became impossible to ignore. The first son, Fernando, was born in 1571. He died at age 7. The second son, Carlos Lorenzo, was born in 1573. He lived less than a day. The third son, Diego, was born in 1575. He died at age 7. The daughter Maria, born in 1580, would survive to adulthood, but remained sickly throughout her life. But the fourth son, born in 1578, survived. His name was Philip, and he would become Philip III of Spain. He inherited his father's kingdom, his wealth, and his increasingly concentrated and dangerous Habsburg genetics. Philip III showed clear signs of the Habsburg jaw, more pronounced than his father's had been. He also displayed what contemporary accounts describe as a passive, almost vacant personality. He had little interest in actually governing and delegated almost all real power to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma. This wasn't just laziness or disinterest. Modern historians who have studied Philip III's behavior and contemporary descriptions suspect he may have had intellectual disabilities, though records don't provide enough detail for certain diagnosis. But here's what Philip III definitely did. He continued the Habsburg tradition of marrying close relatives. In 1599, he married Margaret of Austria, who was his first cousin. Both of Philip III's parents and both of Margaret's parents were Habsburgs. The genetic pool was getting smaller with every generation. Philip III and Margaret had 8 children. 3 survived to adulthood. The mortality rate among Habsburg children was rising with each generation, and the survivors were showing more pronounced deformities. Their son Philip, born in 1605, would become Philip IV of Spain. Philip IV had the most pronounced Habsburg jaw yet seen in the Spanish line. His portraits, even the official ones painted by court artists like Diego Velázquez, who were trying to flatter their subject, show a jaw that protrudes so far forward that his mouth could barely close. Contemporary accounts mention that Philip IV had severe difficulty eating and often drooled because he couldn't keep his mouth properly shut. But Philip IV was still functional enough to rule, though historians debate how effectively. He maintained Spain's position as a major European power, though the empire was beginning its long decline. He was a patron of the arts, commissioning works from masters like Velázquez. And he continued the Habsburg marriage strategy. Philip IV married twice. His first wife was Elizabeth of France, no close relation, and that marriage produced several children, including a son, Balthazar Carlos, who was positioned to inherit the throne. But Balthazar Carlos died at age 16 in 1646. Then Elizabeth died in 1644. Philip needed a new wife, and more importantly, needed to produce a new heir. In 1649, Philip IV married Mariana of Austria. And here's where the Habsburg genetic strategy reached its absolute peak of concentration. Mariana was Philip's niece, the daughter of his sister Maria and his cousin Ferdinand III, which meant Mariana was related to Philip through multiple lines. She was simultaneously his niece, his first cousin once removed, and connected to him through several other family paths. The genetic math here is staggering. When geneticists analyze the Habsburg family tree, they calculate something called a coefficient of inbreeding, which measures how much genetic material a person's mother and father share. A normal person in a diverse population has a coefficient close to 0. Children of first cousins have a coefficient around 0.0625. Children of siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. Philip IV and Mariana's inbreeding coefficient before marriage was already high because of their family connections. Any children they had would have a coefficient that approached or exceeded the level of children born to siblings. The Habsburg family had spent generations concentrating their genetics, and now they were about to produce the ultimate consequence of that strategy. In 1661, Mariana gave birth to a son. He would be named Carlos, after his great-great-grandfather Charles V. He would become Carlos II of Spain. And he would be the living embodiment of everything that can go wrong when a family breeds itself into genetic catastrophe. But before we get to Carlos II, let's understand what was happening across Europe as the Habsburgs pursued this suicidal genetic strategy. Other royal families noticed the problems. Foreign ambassadors sent back reports describing the physical oddities of Habsburg monarchs. Courtiers whispered about the family's strange appearance and increasingly odd behavior. Yet the marriages continued. Why? Because despite the obvious physical problems, the Habsburg system was still working politically. They still controlled massive territories. They were still wealthy beyond imagination. They still had power that other dynasties envied. The Protestant kingdoms of Northern Europe, watching this Catholic dynasty struggle with mysterious health problems, saw it as divine judgment. The Habsburgs were being punished by God for their pride, their excessive wealth, their political ambitions. Some Protestant pamphleteers claimed the family was cursed, that their physical deformities were marks of moral corruption. The Habsburgs themselves occasionally wondered if something supernatural was at play. When children died young or were born with obvious deformities, some courtiers whispered about witchcraft or curses. But the family never seriously questioned their marriage strategy. The political and economic benefits were too clear. The territories stayed united, the wealth stayed concentrated, the power remained in family hands. And so the genetic catastrophe accelerated toward its inevitable conclusion. Each generation, the gene pool got smaller. Each generation, the accumulated recessive genes had more chance to express themselves. Each generation, the family came closer to producing someone so damaged by generations of inbreeding that they couldn't function at all. That someone was about to be born. And his name was Carlos II. On November 6, 1661, Queen Mariana of Austria gave birth to a son in Madrid. The birth was difficult, and the baby who emerged was immediately concerning to the physicians present. But this was the heir to the Spanish throne, and there was celebration across the kingdom. Spain had a prince. The Habsburg dynasty would continue, except it wouldn't, because the baby who would become Carlos II was the genetic endpoint of 200 years of strategic inbreeding. He was the living proof that you cannot indefinitely concentrate a bloodline without catastrophic consequences. Let's start with what we know for certain, documented in contemporary accounts and visible in official portraits. Carlos II had the Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form. His lower jaw protruded so far beyond his upper jaw that when he closed his mouth, there was still a gap you could see from across a room. His teeth didn't meet at all. The upper row sat completely behind the lower row. This wasn't just an aesthetic problem. Carlos couldn't chew food. Everything he ate had to be nearly liquid because he physically couldn't grind food between his teeth. Meal times became lengthy, humiliating ordeals where servants had to prepare special mashed foods, and even then, eating was a slow, messy process. Court records mention that he often dribbled food from his mouth because he couldn't seal his lips properly. His tongue was abnormally large, a condition called macroglossia. Combined with his jaw deformity, this made speech nearly impossible. Carlos could barely talk. When he tried to speak, what came out were wet, slurred sounds that even people who spent every day with him struggled to understand. Foreign ambassadors who met Carlos needed translators not to bridge language barriers, but because the King of Spain literally couldn't form intelligible words. But the jaw and tongue were just the most visible problems. Carlos didn't walk until he was 8 years old, not because of paralysis or a specific injury, but because his body was so weak and poorly developed that he simply couldn't support his own weight. Court records document the efforts to help the young prince walk, the special supports built for him, the years of failed attempts before he finally managed a stumbling gait. Even as an adult, Carlos was physically tiny. He stood barely over 5 feet tall, though his oversized head made him appear even more disproportionate. His limbs were thin and weak. He was frequently sick with infections that his body couldn't fight off properly. Multiple sources describe him as looking more like a sick child than a grown man, even in his 30s. His mental development was equally concerning. Carlos learned to read at age 10, far later than normal. He struggled with basic comprehension throughout his life. He had the intellectual capacity of perhaps a 10 or 12-year-old child, though historians debate this because testing methodology didn't exist, and we only have observers' impressions to go on. But here's what we know for certain about Carlos's behavior. He was emotionally unstable, swinging between periods of childlike dependence and violent tantrums. He was deeply superstitious, believing that he was cursed or possessed. He was sexually immature despite being an adult, showing no interest in women until intense pressure was put on him to produce heirs. Contemporary accounts describe a man who would sit for hours staring at nothing, who would suddenly cry for no apparent reason, who needed constant supervision because he couldn't be trusted to make even basic decisions about daily life. The King of Spain, ruler of a global empire, required handlers like a small child. Venetian ambassadors, whose detailed reports provide some of our best documentation of Carlos's condition, described their shock at meeting him. One wrote that, "The Catholic king is short rather than tall, frail, not robust, ugly, not handsome. He has a long face, jaw very prominent. He cannot stand upright without support and has difficulty eating." Another ambassador reported, "The king is as weak in body as in mind. Now and then he gives signs of intelligence, memory, and a certain liveliness, but not often. He is usually indifferent and slow. One can do with him what one wishes because he lacks his own will. These weren't enemies writing propaganda. These were diplomatic representatives trying to honestly report back to their governments about the man they were negotiating with. And what they described was frankly heartbreaking. A person whose body and mind had been destroyed before he was even born by generations of genetic concentration. Modern geneticists have analyzed Carlos II's family tree using documented genealogical records. His coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254. To put that in perspective, children born to siblings have a coefficient of 0.25. Carlos's parents weren't siblings, but generations of intermarrying meant they shared so much genetic material that having a child together was genetically equivalent to, or worse than, a sibling marriage. The geneticists who published this analysis in 2009 concluded that Carlos's multiple health problems were almost certainly due to genetic disorders that became homozygous, meaning he inherited the same defective gene from both parents. These likely included defects affecting growth hormone production, immune system function, and possibly metabolic problems that contributed to his overall poor health. But in the 1660s and 1670s, nobody understood genetics. They saw Carlos's problems and searched for other explanations. Many in the Spanish court, including Carlos himself, believed he was bewitched. The nickname El Hechizado, the bewitched one, wasn't just courtly gossip. It was how people genuinely tried to explain why their king was so obviously damaged. This belief in supernatural causes would lead to some of the most bizarre episodes in Carlos's life. But before we get to those, we need to talk about the most important thing Carlos was supposed to do as king: produce an heir. In 1679, at age 18, Carlos was married to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France. Marie-Louise was by all accounts an attractive, intelligent young woman who found herself trapped in a nightmare marriage. Carlos was physically incapable of consummating the marriage properly. Exactly what the problems were isn't documented in detail, but multiple sources confirm that Carlos's sexual organs were underdeveloped and that he had what we would now call erectile dysfunction. For 10 years, Marie-Louise endured this marriage. Spanish court pressure for her to produce an heir was immense. She was subjected to humiliating medical examinations. She was forced to undergo fertility treatments that included drinking disgusting herbal concoctions and having various powders and potions applied to her body. All of this was based on the assumption that the problem was her fertility, not Carlos's physical incapacity. The psychological toll on Marie-Louise was devastating. Letters from her time in Spain describe increasing depression and desperation. In 1689, she died suddenly at age 27. The official cause was listed as intestinal problems, but historians have speculated she may have been poisoned, possibly by pro-Austrian factions at court who wanted Carlos to remarry to someone who might somehow produce an heir. Less than a year later, Carlos married again. His second wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She spent 11 years trying to get pregnant by a man who was probably physically incapable of fathering children. Like Marie-Louise before her, Maria Anna was blamed for the failure to produce heirs. She was subjected to the same humiliating examinations and useless treatments, but the problem was obvious to anyone willing to see it. Carlos II was sterile. His underdeveloped reproductive system, like everything else about his body, was the result of generations of genetic damage. The Habsburg dynasty of Spain was going to end with him because his ancestors had spent 2 centuries eliminating their own genetic diversity. As Carlos aged, his health deteriorated further. By his 30s, he was suffering from what sound like epileptic seizures. He had periodic episodes where he would lose consciousness and convulse. He suffered from hallucinations. His body began breaking down in multiple ways simultaneously. Spanish doctors, lacking any understanding of genetic disease, tried everything. They bled him repeatedly, a standard medical treatment that probably made his anemia and weakness worse. They gave him increasingly bizarre medications made from ground-up gemstones, animal parts, and toxic metals. Nothing helped because nothing could help. The damage was built into every cell of his body. By the late 1690s, everyone knew Carlos was dying and would leave no heirs. The major powers of Europe were already preparing for the War of Spanish Succession, ready to fight over who would control the massive Spanish Empire once Carlos was gone. The king himself knew his death would plunge Europe into war, but he was powerless to prevent it. Carlos II died on November 1st, 1700, 1 month before his 39th birthday. He had ruled Spain for 35 years, though ruled is generous. He had been a puppet king, manipulated by various factions at court, while the empire he inherited slowly crumbled around him. But here's the most grotesque part of Carlos's story, the detail that drives home just how damaged he was. Shortly before his death, convinced that he was cursed, Carlos agreed to an exorcism. The King of Spain, ruler of a global empire, spent his final weeks being subjected to religious rituals designed to cast out demons that were really just genetic defects. And when he finally died, even death didn't end the horror of what the Habsburg family had done to themselves. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. You might think the Habsburg disaster was an isolated case, a single family that took inbreeding too far. But here's the truly disturbing reality. The Habsburg genetic catastrophe was just the most extreme example of a problem that spread across European royalty, like a slow-acting poison. And that poison had a name you've definitely heard of: hemophilia. Let me introduce you to Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, who ruled from 1837 to 1901. Victoria wasn't a Habsburg, and she didn't show obvious physical deformities. But Victoria was a carrier of hemophilia B, a genetic blood clotting disorder. And through the intricate web of European royal marriages, Victoria's defective genes spread across the continent, causing suffering and death in multiple royal families over 3 generations. Here's how genetic carrier status works in simple terms. Victoria had 1 normal copy of the gene for blood clotting and 1 mutated copy. Because she was female, and the mutation is on the X chromosome, she didn't have hemophilia herself. But she could pass that defective gene to her children. Her sons who inherited it would have hemophilia. Her daughters who inherited it would be carriers like her. Victoria had 9 children. She married them off to royal families across Europe in marriages that were supposed to cement British influence and create stable political alliances. Instead, she was spreading a genetic time bomb that would have consequences for European history itself. Her 8th child, Leopold, born in 1853, had hemophilia. He lived to age 30, but died from a brain hemorrhage after a minor fall, which is exactly what happens to hemophiliacs when their blood can't clot properly. Several of Victoria's daughters were carriers, and when they married into other royal families, they brought the gene with them. Princess Alice, Victoria's 3rd child, married Ludwig IV of Hesse in Germany. Alice was a carrier. Her daughter, also named Alex but later called Alexandra Feodorovna, inherited the carrier gene. And in 1894, Alexandra married Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia. In 1904, Alexandra gave birth to a son, Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov, the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne. And Alexei had hemophilia. Severe hemophilia that meant even a minor bump or bruise could cause internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. A cut that would be trivial for a normal child could kill him. The impact on Russian history was enormous. Alexandra, desperate to protect her constantly endangered son, fell under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a mystical healer who seemed able to help Alexei during bleeding episodes, probably just through calming the child and his mother, which would lower blood pressure and slow bleeding. Rasputin's influence over the royal family created a scandal that undermined the monarchy's credibility. When World War I went badly for Russia, popular anger focused partly on the German woman Alexandra and her relationship with the controversial Rasputin. The royal family's isolation from reality, partly caused by their obsessive protection of Alexei's condition which they tried to keep secret, contributed to their inability to respond to revolutionary pressures. In 1918, The Bolsheviks executed the entire Romanov family. Alexei was 14 years old. He died from bullets, not from hemophilia. But the genetic disease his grandmother's genes gave him had helped create the political crisis that led to his execution. But the hemophilia spread further. Victoria's youngest daughter, Beatrice, was also a carrier. She married into the Spanish royal family. Her son, Alfonso, had hemophilia. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, married King Alfonso III of Spain and had 2 sons with hemophilia. The Spanish royal family dealt with the same nightmare of constantly endangered heirs, secret medical crises, and political complications. The pattern was clear. European royalty, so obsessed with maintaining bloodlines and creating political alliances through marriage, had created an interconnected genetic disaster zone. They were all related to each other through multiple family connections, and diseases like hemophilia spread through their family tree like wildfire through dry brush. But let's go back further in history to show this wasn't just a Victorian-era problem. Remember the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt? For nearly 3 centuries, from 305 BC to 30 BC, the Ptolemaic rulers practiced brother-sister marriage as standard operating procedure. This wasn't occasional or for specific political reasons. This was systematic, generational incest that made the Habsburgs look restrained. Cleopatra VII, the famous last queen of Egypt who lived from 69 to 30 BC, was the product of multiple generations of these brother-sister marriages. Her parents were likely siblings. Her grandparents were likely siblings. Go back far enough and the genetic concentration becomes staggering. Yet Cleopatra herself was by all accounts intelligent, politically capable, and showed no obvious severe deformities. How did she escape the genetic catastrophe that destroyed Carlos II? Partly luck. Partly because even in a highly inbred population, you can get lucky with which genes you inherit. But many of her siblings and relatives weren't so lucky. Infant mortality in the Ptolemaic royal family was extremely high. Many children died young, or were born with problems that ancient sources mention, but don't describe in detail. The difference between Ptolemaic Egypt and Habsburg Spain comes down to documentation. We have incredible detail about Carlos II's problems because he lived in an era of detailed court records, diplomatic reports, and portrait painting. The Ptolemaic royals lived in an era where written records were less comprehensive and portrait art was more stylized. But the biological reality was the same. You cannot concentrate a bloodline indefinitely without consequences. The Ptolemaic dynasty eventually collapsed, partly from political factors, but also because their later rulers were increasingly incompetent, possibly due to genetic damage from generations of incest. Here's what makes the European royal situation particularly ironic. By the 19th century, scientists were beginning to understand heredity. Gregor Mendel published his work on genetic inheritance in 1866. Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The basic principles of how traits pass from parents to children were becoming scientifically understood. Yet European royalty continued intermarrying. They continued creating these genetic disaster scenarios. Why? Because political considerations always trumped biological reality. Marrying within the exclusive club of royalty was more important than genetic health. Maintaining pure bloodlines and keeping alliances within the proper social class mattered more than the physical and mental health of the children produced. The truly disturbing part is that by the early 20th century, when hemophilia was ravaging various royal families, and when the scientific understanding of heredity was well established, some royals were still making the same mistakes. The interconnected nature of European royalty meant that by World War I, the Kaiser of Germany, the Tsar of Russia, and the King of Britain were all first cousins, grandchildren of Queen Victoria. They ruled empires that would go to war against each other, killing millions, while being genetically close enough that they shared genetic diseases. The Kaiser had a withered arm, likely from a birth injury but possibly with a genetic component. The Tsarevich had hemophilia from his grandmother Victoria's genes. The whole system of European royalty was literally blood-related while drowning in blood from both genetic disease and the wars their political system created. The Habsburg jaw wasn't the only marker of royal inbreeding. Various European royal families showed different signs. Mental instability in the Wittelsbach family of Bavaria, where multiple members were declared insane and locked away. Physical weakness and susceptibility to disease in various lines. Psychiatric problems that ran through families with suspicious regularity. King George III of Britain, who ruled from 1760 to 1820 and famously went mad later in life, likely suffered from porphyria, a genetic metabolic disorder that can cause psychiatric symptoms. Modern analysis of the British royal family tree shows multiple members across generations who had similar symptoms, suggesting a genetic disease running through the family line. The Portuguese royal family in the 19th century had multiple members with severe mental illness, probably partly genetic, exacerbated by centuries of intermarriage with Spanish Habsburgs and other European royalty. King Miguel of Portugal, who ruled briefly in the 1820s and 1830s, was described by contemporaries as possibly intellectually disabled and definitely emotionally unstable. Every major European royal house, if you dig into their medical histories, shows signs of genetic problems that correlate with their degree of intermarrying. The more closely related the marriages, the worse the problems. And yet the system continued into the 20th century, only really ending when most European monarchies were abolished or drastically reduced in power. The Habsburg catastrophe was the most dramatic, the most documented, and the most complete genetic disaster. Carlos II was the ultimate endpoint, the proof that you really can breed a family into genetic extinction. But he was part of a larger pattern of European royalty systematically destroying their own genetic health in the name of political power. And the lesson: that biology doesn't care about your titles, your territories, or your political ambitions. Genes don't recognize royal authority. You can call yourself king, emperor, or tsar. But if you concentrate defective genes through generation after generation of inbreeding, eventually biology will present you with a bill that cannot be paid except in human suffering. Carlos II died on November 1st, 1700. He had no children, no heir, no way to continue the Spanish Habsburg line. After 184 years of Spanish Habsburg rule, after controlling the largest empire in history, after amassing wealth beyond imagination, the dynasty ended with a man so genetically damaged he couldn't reproduce. But the story doesn't end with Carlos's death. Because what happened next proves just how catastrophic the Habsburg marriage strategy really was. The moment Carlos died, the War of Spanish Succession began. It lasted from 1700 to 1714 and killed an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 people across Europe and the Americas. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of people died fighting over who would control the Spanish throne, because the previous dynasty had bred itself into extinction. The Habsburg obsession with keeping power concentrated in family hands didn't just destroy their own bloodline. It triggered one of the deadliest conflicts of the 18th century. The war was fought between those supporting the French Bourbon claim to the Spanish throne, those supporting the Austrian Habsburg claim, and various other factions with their own interests. Spain itself was torn apart by civil conflict. The Spanish Netherlands, Italy, and other Habsburg territories became battlegrounds. Ships fought in the Caribbean. Soldiers died from India to Gibraltar. And all of this destruction, all of this death, stemmed from a simple biological reality. You cannot eliminate genetic diversity without eventually eliminating your ability to reproduce. The Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries perfecting a system of strategic marriage that accumulated territories while concentrating bloodlines. The system worked brilliantly for political expansion. It failed catastrophically at basic biology. Here's what modern geneticists discovered when they analyzed the Habsburg family tree. The study, published in 2009 by Spanish researchers Alvarez, Ceballos, and Quintero in the journal PLOS ONE, used 16 generations of genealogical data to calculate inbreeding coefficients for Habsburg family members. They found that the inbreeding coefficient increased steadily through generations. Early Habsburgs like Maximilian the Fern had low coefficients, similar to normal populations. By the time of Philip II, coefficients were elevated but not catastrophic. But by Carlos II's generation, the numbers were shocking. His coefficient of 0.254 meant he was more inbred than the average child of siblings would be. The researchers concluded that the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was not an accident of history or bad luck. It was the predictable genetic consequence of their marriage strategy. They literally bred themselves out of existence. But the study found something even more interesting. They traced the Habsburg jaw through portraits and medical descriptions across generations. The prominence of the jaw increased with the inbreeding coefficient. It wasn't just that Carlos II happened to have an extreme case. The mandibular prognathism got progressively worse with each generation as genetic diversity decreased. They also analyzed child mortality rates across Habsburg generations. In the generation before Carlos II, more than 50% of children died before age 10. For comparison, in the Spanish general population of the same era, child mortality was around 20–30%. The Habsburg children were dying at twice the normal rate, and this rate increased with each generation. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family fared somewhat better, but only because they occasionally married slightly more distantly related people. But even they showed increasing problems by the 18th century. The last male Habsburg, Charles VI, had only daughters, and one of them, Maria Theresa, had to fight the War of Austrian Succession to secure her inheritance because so many other powers challenged a female heir's right to rule. The Habsburg system wasn't sustainable. It was always going to end in genetic catastrophe. The only question was when. Carlos VI was just the most dramatic example of inevitable biological failure. But here's the truly haunting part of this story. We can now go to museums and see the progression of genetic disaster in real time. The Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna has portraits of Habsburg rulers spanning 2 centuries. You can literally watch the jaw getting more prominent, the faces becoming more deformed, the physical signs of genetic damage accumulating across generations. Early portraits of Maximilian I show a relatively normal face. Carlos V has a slightly protruding jaw. Philip II has a more noticeable jaw. Philip III's jaw is quite prominent. Philip IV looks distinctly odd, even in flattering court portraits. And then there's Carlos II, whose portrait by Juan Carreño de Miranda from 1680 shows a face so deformed that the artist, despite trying to present a dignified royal image, couldn't hide the catastrophic jaw, the vacant expression, the overall sense that something had gone terribly wrong. These portraits aren't propaganda or exaggeration. They're understated, if anything. Court painters were trying to flatter their subjects. The reality was worse than the portraits show. Foreign ambassadors who saw Carlos II in person reported being shocked by how much worse he looked than his portraits suggested. Modern medical experts who have analyzed Carlos II's portraits and contemporary descriptions believe he likely suffered from several genetic disorders simultaneously. Possibly combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which would explain his small stature and underdeveloped sexual characteristics. Possibly renal tubular acidosis, which would explain some of his metabolic problems. Possibly mandibulofacial dysostosis, which would explain the extreme jaw protrusion. The exact diagnoses are less important than the pattern. Multiple genetic disorders, all expressing in the same person, because he inherited damaging recessive genes from both parents who were themselves related through multiple family lines. Carlos II was what happens when you take the concept of royal bloodlines to its logical biological conclusion. In 2019, researchers went even further. They analyzed DNA extracted from Habsburg remains, including Habsburg rulers from different generations. The genetic analysis confirmed what genealogical records suggested. The family's genetic diversity decreased dramatically over time, and the concentration of recessive genetic variants increased proportionally. The researchers could identify specific genetic markers associated with the Habsburg jaw. They could trace the inheritance of these markers through generations. They could prove, with hard genetic data, that the facial deformities weren't random. They were the direct result of recessive genes becoming homozygous through inbreeding. This is what makes the Habsburg story so important beyond just historical curiosity. It's a perfect case study in population genetics, in what happens when you eliminate genetic diversity. It proves that historical records and portraits, when analyzed carefully, can reveal genetic information even centuries later. And it demonstrates that no amount of wealth, power, or political skill can override basic biology. The Habsburg dynasty didn't fall to military conquest. They weren't overthrown by revolution. They weren't defeated by superior enemies. They defeated themselves, slowly, over 2 centuries, through a systematic elimination of their own genetic diversity. The irony is perfect and terrible. The Habsburgs wanted to keep their blood pure. They wanted to avoid contaminating their royal lineage with common blood. They wanted to ensure that power stayed within the family, and in pursuing this goal, they created the opposite of purity. They created genetic catastrophe. They produced Carlos II, a man so damaged by his pure bloodline that he couldn't perform the most basic function of royalty, continuing the dynasty. The final Habsburg insult? Carlos II's body was so poorly preserved that when his tomb was opened centuries later for research, his remains had deteriorated more than bodies from the same era that hadn't been protected in royal tombs. Even in death, his genetically compromised body couldn't maintain itself. The Spanish throne eventually went to Philip V, a French Bourbon. The Austrian Habsburgs continued for another 2 centuries, but with different marriage strategies and increasing genetic mixing with other families. The age of extreme royal inbreeding was effectively over, not because of enlightened thinking or scientific understanding, but because the Habsburg experiment had proved so catastrophically that continuing such practices meant dynastic suicide. Today we can look at the Habsburg story and see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolating populations, of eliminating genetic diversity, of prioritizing purity over health. We can see the portraits of increasingly deformed rulers and understand, in a way that people in the 17th century couldn't, exactly what was happening at a cellular level. The throne of deformity wasn't a curse. It wasn't divine punishment. It wasn't witchcraft or demonic possession. It was genetics, pure and simple. It was biology asserting itself over political ambition. It was the inevitable result of treating human reproduction as a political tool rather than a biological process. And Carlos II, the final Habsburg king of Spain, remains one of history's most tragic figures. Not because he was evil or because he chose his fate, but because his catastrophic health problems were predetermined by decisions made generations before he was born. He was doomed from conception, a living example of what happens when power and privilege try to override the basic rules of biology. The Habsburgs wanted to create a dynasty that would last forever, with power concentrated in the hands of one family, unmixed and undiluted. Instead, they created a genetic dead end. They proved that royal blood, concentrated and purified through generation after generation of inbreeding, doesn't become more noble. It becomes poison. That's the true legacy of the Habsburg dynasty. Not the territories they controlled or the wealth they accumulated, but the grotesque demonstration that biology always wins. Always.